From wines and cheeses aged in France, to olive oil pressed in Spain, and planes built across Europe. All these products will soon be subject to U.S. tariffs after a record-breaking World Trade Organization ruling.
That was a big win for the United States, right?
It was.
You never had wins with other presidents, did you? But we're having a lot of wins at the WTO since I became president.
This was a case that started, I think, 10 or 15 years ago.
The WTO has given the U.S. the green light for tariffs on $7.5 billion of European goods. It's in retaliation for what the trade body says are illegal subsidies for plane maker Airbus, which has facilities in France, Germany, Spain, and the UK. Washington says it's slapping a 10% charge on Airbus aircraft and a 25% penalty on French wine, Scotch whiskey, and cheese from across the continent. The tariffs are set to take effect on October the 18th, and the European Union says it'll respond with its own penalties on U.S. goods.
Trade is so much more than simply numbers. Trade is about people's livelihoods and jobs. Trade wars are easy to start, but escalate quickly and usually end badly. If someone is imposing tariffs on our aviation sector, we'll do exactly the same.
We will envisage retaliatory measures. We will look at that at the European Union level. I want to say that I regret that we are engaged in this commercial war with the US.
In a near mirror image of the Airbus case, the WTO has also ruled U.S. subsidies for Boeing illegal. A final decision on how much the EU can hit back is expected in the coming months. Paolo Montecillo, TRT World.
Well, for more on the US tariffs, let's go to Michael Maibach in Washington. He's the Managing Director of the James Wilson Institute and the former President and CEO of the European American Business Council. Welcome to the program, Michael. Now, US President Donald Trump wasted no time in imposing these new tariffs on EU goods, but can the US really afford to wage another trade war?
Well, that's a great question, and we're seeing global GDP growth affected, of course, by all these different trade actions. The restart of NAFTA, if that gets through the Congress, we have the Chinese-U.S. trade war with tariffs, and now this U.S.-European. But I think it's helpful to understand the context of what Mr. Trump, I think, is about, and I think the context will help us understand what his goal is. Whether he'll succeed is unclear, but be happy to discuss some of that.
Okay, now the WTO will determine whether the EU can impose its own tariffs on US goods in the coming months. Isn't the US just as guilty of awarding subsidies to Boeing, the American plane maker?
Well, I'm not an expert in that industry. Obviously, I came from the semiconductor industry, not the aviation. I believe that the fundamental difference is there were national governments that owned parts of Airbus as really state-owned enterprises, and the U.S. never had an ownership in Boeing. They had R&D subsidies because Boeing supplies defense products into the military, as does Airbus, although Airbus has a smaller piece of that business. So they both have received government support, but I think the nature is different. But you would have to ask someone at one of those companies or some person that studied this to have more details about it. But I think this dispute and these tariffs are about something much bigger than aviation.
Okay, and what is that thing that's bigger than the planes themselves?
Well, if I could just briefly say that before the Great Depression and the Second World War, we had the Wild West of trade. Then when the World War II was ended, we had in 1947 GATT, the General Agreements on Tariffs and Trade. Many countries joined, and we had 7 GATT rounds, they call it, the Kennedy round, the Tokyo round, the Uruguay round, all of which were reducing trade protectionism and tariffs, all expanding what we would want to have, which is a free market in world trade. But in 2001, the Chinese entered the WTO, and the Chinese have a very different corporate culture, if you will, mercantilism and protectionism. They don't pay attention to intellectual property laws, on and on. Very different player. And the WTO has really been frozen since then. No successful rounds in 18 years. And so fast forward to Mr. Trump. He gets into the presidency. He's got Mexico now with NAFTA as a platform to export into the United States. He's got the Chinese not behaving as a free and open market for our goods and services, and for our forcing companies to share their technology, et cetera. And the only tool he has, because the WTO tool is really frozen, are tariffs, because he doesn't have a very cooperative Congress. So you have a president that's trying to change the entire set table that's been set before him in his first term in office. So he's doing a lot of things with tariffs, not because long-term he wants to close markets, but he wants to use tariffs to open markets. It's a very difficult procedure to do. You'd rather have negotiations than tariffs, but he doesn't have a place to go unless he just wants the status quo, and he's not a status quo man, as he showed us.
Interesting. Now, we know that this tariff war has hurt both the Chinese and American sides. Farmers in America have been hurt by the Chinese tariffs. Equally, those in China have also been impacted by it. So do you think that's just the price that both sides will have to pay in order to get Trump's way in terms of changing China's trade practices, which he says are unfair?
You make a good point. It's in both China and the U.S. interest to reach a trade deal as soon as possible. Mr. Trump does have higher cards, because for every dollar that we sell to China, we buy $5 from them. We have a huge trade deficit with them, the largest in world history. And so he has a lot more leverage. And they have growth problems. They've got Hong Kong now rocking the boat. And he's the ruler for life. And so everything that goes wrong, he's blamed for. So Mr. Trump has a re-election coming up next year. Both of these leaders are really playing a very strategic and high-stakes game. The best result would be between now and, let's say, January or earlier, to have a strong trade agreement with the U.S. and China and get that settled. I think also the U.S. and European Union ought to go into talks on zeroing out all industrial tariffs between the two countries as soon as possible. They can work on services and other trade issues after that, but I think zero tariffs across the Atlantic while trying to change things in China should be on top of his list.
Okay, Michael Maibach in Washington. We'll have to leave it there, but thanks so much again for your analysis.